There's a great study coming out of the University of Utah where they look at the neurobiology of people in mountain towns. And what they found is that certain neurochemical indicators differ between people at high elevations and low elevations. And what the science is showing is that people at higher elevations have a different neurochemistry than people at lower elevations.
Serotonin is critical for reducing both anxiety and depression. If you stop making serotonin, you're going to have more depression. It's going to be harder to treat. Higher altitudes also decrease dopamine synthesis, which is the other transmitter system that we think is highly related to changes in brain chemistry.
The brain's production of serotonin depends on how much oxygen is available because one of the enzymes that produces it needs a lot of oxygen in order to function. And we know that if somebody is relatively hypoxic, it reduces serotonin production in their brain. There have been older studies that have found that lower serotonin levels are associated with suicide death.
What kind of general health conditions do you have?
One thing that could imply is that traditional antidepressants like Prozac don't actually have as much effect at high altitude because there's not enough serotonin initially to increase at the synapse. My part in the research is working with patients in clinical trials. We've looked at brain energy storage using a lot of the neuroimaging techniques we have available here. Your brain is about 2% of your overall body mass, and it uses about 20% of your overall energy. Oxygen availability is one of the things that most powerfully affects how much energy is available. People with depression have relatively low brain energy, so we want to show that depression, suicidal ideation, other mental disorders are ultimately physical illnesses, right? They are due to brain abnormalities, because one thing that we really want to do is translate our theories about how altitude contributes to depression and suicide into treatments that will work for people. That's the goal.
Do you think that we've got enough detail here in the frontal cortex?
The data quality is pretty good.
But the reality is that none of us think that altitude is the only thing that causes high rates of suicide in the West. There are lots of other things that are probably happening.
There might be some biological factors involved, but those models don't explain individual differences within people or across different groups of people. We need to think about the biological, the social, but also as a psychologist, I'm interested in the psychological processes. I'm here at the University of Wyoming. Our mascot is the cowboy image. We value that cowboy mentality. We value problem solving.
For a person in that frontier state, the worst kind of outcome that they can predict is hitting up against a problem that they can't solve.
So part of what goes along with this culture of, sometimes we think of it as masculinity or a culture of honor, is a stoicism, especially if you're an older white man who grew up with that as your culture. Another group that has really high rates of suicide in the Mountain West is Native Americans. Their suicide rates can't be accounted for entirely by the altitude. There's some other things going on with the way that they have been sent to reservations and live their life in a very different way under a lot of burdens from the rest of the country.
I personally know that growing up, we didn't talk about our problems because of the trauma and the historical trauma that we've all been through. We were taught to stay silent. We were taught to keep everything secret. And now I'm on the other side of it. I was able to recognize that I needed the help.
So for our lab meeting today, we're going to be talking about the interpersonal theory of suicide. What comes to mind as things that might be cultural factors for older white men that might contribute to their rates of suicide?
I feel like a lot of older men, they grew up in a generation where they felt like they were very important to society. As they get older, they feel like they lose that purpose.
Bereavement, loss of social supports.
Feeling like you're isolated. When you start looking at hundreds of cases of suicide and thousands of cases through the region, we can start looking at patterns, and we can start hopefully identifying some factors that can help us identify the people who are particularly at risk. The next part of the interpersonal theory of suicide is this acquired capability for suicide. The things that make people more likely to die by suicide is if they have built up a pain tolerance and then they have gotten over their fear of death.
People live on ranches. Of a lot of people in Wyoming, because they're very used to death.
If you grew up using guns for hunting, it becomes something that's normal and something that you are skilled at.